It warms, who will the winners and losers be? In a recent experiment in Antarctica, British Antarctic Survey and Smithsonian Environmental Research Center scientists warmed a layer of water 1 degree Celsius, and the results were dramatic. In 2 months, certain species not dominant in the area took off. One bryozoan, a tiny filter-feeding animal, multiplied so fast it drove out many of the other species. Another small worm grew to 70% bigger than its normal size. Now, if I did that, you'd be asking me to go to Weight Watchers. But this worm thrived in the warmer water. Maybe it was eating the bryozoans. Who knows? This is the first experiment of its kind to artificially warm an area of seawater to simulate what is expected to happen within the next 50 to 100 years and study which species survive. For reasons not yet totally understood, polar ecosystems are more susceptible to the effects of global warming than are the mid-latitudes. And speaking of things that are exacerbated by the warming of the oceans, Tommy has this story.
Yeah, everybody's been hearing about the storm down south, and Hurricane Harvey continues to wreak environmental havoc in Texas. At least 13 toxic waste sites were flooded or damaged during the 4-day weather event. The 13 affected sites contained industrial waste from petrochemical companies, acid compounds, solvents, and pesticides. 5,000 residents within 1.5 miles of the Arkema chemical plant in Houston were evacuated due to a series of explosions. Early Thursday, 2 blasts blew open a trailer containing at least 2 tons of material, sending up a plume of black smoke and flames up to 30 to 40 feet high in the tiny town of Crosby, which is about a half hour from Houston. The Texas Environmental Agency called the smoke especially acrid and irritating, and said it can impair breathing and inflame eyes, nose, and throat. Questions persisted Friday about the adequacy of Arkema's master plan to protect the public in the event of an emergency in flood-prone Houston, a metropolitan area of about 6 million people. The plant is no longer required to keep a public record of which chemicals are being stored at their facilities due to a 2014 decision by then Attorney General Greg Abbott, who is now governor. Harris County Sheriff's Department reported that 15 of its deputies went to the hospital after getting close to the Arkema plant and inhaling what they called a non-toxic irritant. The Crosby plant was cited with 8 serious safety violations last year for failure to prevent catastrophic releases of toxic, reactive, flammable, or explosive chemicals. The owners of the plant did not report the failure of their generator, but an employee called in the incident. The EPA announced Saturday that they had assessed 41 sites using aerial images.
And those are 41 Superfund sites that were already in trouble, so they needed to be monitoring them. And Joe, you have a story or comment?
Yeah, well, first a comment on that, because there's not this comment being made. All the weather people I see, weathermen, weatherwomen on TV, none of them are saying anything about a climate connection here. So, hey, we might as well pound this message out there early and often that no, global warming, climate chaos did not cause this hurricane, but it almost certainly had a big role in intensifying it, out of control. And this is the kind of thing that's going to be happening more and more. You can expect this. Better get ready for it.
Because the oceans are warming. They're warmer already.
Yeah,
the reason being the connection.
And the infrared radiation is trapped by these greenhouse gases in the lower atmosphere, and you end up with more energy in the atmosphere. And with more energy in the atmosphere, you end up with greater extremes, including much greater cold here and there now and then, as well as much greater hot, floods, droughts, fires. Everything is just intensified. So that, we got to get that message into people's heads that despite what people are telling you or are not telling you, global warming has a lot to do with this. And unfortunately, most of that, if not all of that, is human caused, the excessive amount of global warming. There are natural climate cycles, but the natural climate variation that we would be experiencing right now if humans were not on the earth would actually be a cooling. So instead, we're seeing this intensification, this overheating. I don't even want to call it global warming. That's too bland a word. Just like climate change is too bland. It should be climate chaos or climate havoc, and it should be global overheating.
And if you saw the pictures from India as well, there's much flooding there. So these events are starting to look like there's a pattern when you watch the news and see all these people struggling through water or heat waves.
And that's even way, way worse, if you can believe it, than what's being experienced down in Houston. By the way, I did have a story on top of that comment.
Over to you, Joe.
This is actually some good news. Scotland, the little nation of Scotland, has set world records for itself, for its own power generation, just in the last 6 months, in both wind power and in tidal power. And more later on both of those. I think I've taken up my time. But tidal power, by the way, is not solar power. It's lunar power, but it's all sky power. And, there's been a lot of attention paid to the moon just lately. You all know why, right? Eclipse. Well, hey, so there you go. There's something else relating to the moon, tidal power.
And
not wave power.
Here's one more bit of good news, I think, potentially anyway. In the future, your shirt could generate clean power. Now, maybe not my shirt after the hot weather we've been having, but clean power. Scientists at the University of Texas at Dallas and Hyang University in South Korea has developed high-tech yarns that generate electricity when they're stretched or twisted. In a study in the August 25 issue of journal Science, researchers described twistron yarns and their possible applications, such as harvesting energy from the motion of ocean waves or from temperature fluctuations. When sewn into a shirt, these yarns served as a self-powering breathing monitor. Very cool stuff.
I suppose it could also power your cell phone or something, charge up your cell phone. But
yeah.
Are you about to move into introducing our guest? Because I have a little segue for that.
Okay, segue away.
Yeah, we were talking about heat, and if you look, those of you who are watching the show, you can see that some kind of fog, or maybe it's an oncoming thunderstorm. There's a bunch of clouds that have suddenly taken over the east side of Santa Cruz. It's still blazing hot sunny where I just came from over on the west side. There are supposed to maybe be some dry lightning thunderstorms tomorrow. But it has been bloody hot out here. I mean, nothing compared to East Coast hot and humid that I grew up with, but it's still really intense, searing, dry heat. Well, and of course we're talking about global warming and global overheating, and our guest is going to tell us about how one result of that is some maybe abnormal or at least curious motions of giant ice sheets in the Antarctic. But Robert Frost, the great American poet, wrote a poem about both fire and ice. In fact, it's a little poem. The title is Fire and Ice, and here's how that goes. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice.
Very deep.
Segue into ice now, not the pause that refreshes.
Yes. 117 is the highest temperature I have heard recorded, not officially, but in our region. And if you're listening in Columbus, Ohio, our affiliates there, it may not be quite as searing as it is out here. So we salute you, because it normally is.
Probably more humid, though.
Yes. We're excited to have Grace Barczyk. She is a senior PhD student at UC Santa Cruz here in Santa Cruz, California, getting her PhD in Earth and Planetary Sciences with a focus on seismology and glaciology. She got her undergraduate degree from Washington University in St. Louis, also in Earth and Planetary Sciences. And she's been in Antarctica 3 times, which is 3 times more than most people on this planet. So welcome, Grace. We're glad to have you on board.
Hi, great to be here.
Great to be here. So the first thing a lot of people want to know is just how cold is it down there?
Well, that depends a lot on where you are in the ice sheet. If you are in one of the sort of lower elevation places, it can be, or near the coast, it can be quite temperate, around freezing or a little bit lower. If you're somewhere in the middle of the ice sheet, far away from the coast, and where the ice is really thick and you're really high, it can be quite cold. Just like when you're in the mountains, it gets colder as you go up to the top.
How cold?
How cold? Let's say, I wish I could remember the coldest recorded, but minus 30 would be pretty typical.
Celsius, that is?
Minus 40.
How about your
They're about the same in that range.
How about
Celsius
your personal record? Do you keep track of what the coldest is? Of course, you were in a parka, so it's not like you were, but your face, I guess, was exposed directly.
The coldest that I know the temperature of, I think, was minus 28. So not the coldest in Antarctica, but pretty cold.
And at that temperature, if your hand was out of its glove for very long, what would happen to it?
If it were windy, which it almost always is, you'd probably get frostbite. I'm not sure how long it would take, but it would probably not take more than 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
You haven't done that experiment. You were working on other experiments.
I've not tried to freeze any of my body parts on purpose. No.
Well, we're going to get in a moment to what brought you to the very far ends of the Earth, to the south of us. But first, let's just tell a little bit about how you get there. In the old days, Antarctic explorers had to get on boats for months, probably, just braving some pretty severe weather. Tell us about your journey from Santa Cruz to all the way out in what most people would call the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. Well, we fly there. There are still programs on Earth where people get on boats and they take a boat to Antarctica, but in the U.S., we all fly there. So we all transit through New Zealand, through Christchurch, New Zealand, where we stop and we get our cold weather gear. And then we spend a couple days in New Zealand getting our parkas and our boots and all of that good stuff. And then we fly to McMurdo from New Zealand. And so it's about a 6 to 8 hour flight south of New Zealand to get to McMurdo Station, which is the American base, sort of like base camp town in Antarctica.
And how big of a group and how many women and men?
In McMurdo?
No, in your group.
In my group.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've been down a number of times.
How about the last time?
So the last time from UC Santa Cruz, I think there were 4 of us, and it was 2 women and 2 men. Yeah.
Did you still talk to each other after the trip?
Yes, yes, we did.
Good. That means it went well, I suppose.
Yeah.
Most of us don't know what it looks like and feels like. So you get to McMurdo, and then you're transited to another space. Tell us about that leap, because McMurdo, most people don't even know what that's like. Tell us a little bit about what those places are like when you first look around them.
Sure. Well, so McMurdo Station on the coast is on a volcanic island. So it is quite brown if you look down, but if you look around you, you get to see sort of ice-covered mountains and sea ice, which is quite beautiful. When you head out to the deep field, which is what we call anywhere that's not McMurdo in Antarctica, it could be anywhere from 20-minute helicopter ride away to 4 or 5 hours in an airplane to several airplane flights away. In the deep field, for the most part, once you land your airplane and you look around you, all you see is just flat, white, snow on the surface. It's kind of like looking out to the horizon on the ocean, only it's white. And the sky is beautiful and blue.
What if the sky gets white? Are you just like inside of a white gauze? What does that look like?
Yeah, when it gets cloudy or if it starts snowing, the light becomes very, very flat, and you can't see surface topography anymore. You could basically walk into a hole without seeing it. You could walk into a wall because the sky is white and the ground is white and there are no shadows.
And it must be very easy to get lost. So you're camped at this flat nowhere land in the middle of the ice. If the wind blew you off course on your way home from the loo back to your tent, you could be forever lost. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that's a good point. And so in Antarctica, we always put out flag lines between important places, like the bathroom and the cook tent, so that if it does for some reason turn into a whiteout, we can follow the flag lines back to a warm space.
Good idea. And it must be like being on another planet in some ways. These little capsules of tents keep out the inclement, horrible cold. Sort of. Yeah. So what is it like versus the outside, inside these little enclosures? You have a galley and a tent. What else? And how cold is it inside?
We have inside of our main tents, the galley, the cook tents. In the larger camps, there usually are heaters. So it will be maybe 55 or 60 degrees inside those tents. And that's only because those heaters are pumping out heat constantly.
Actually, this reminds me, you can tell me if you experienced this. I believe this was from the South Pole Station. I met a guy once, came and talked over at NASA Ames, who had overwintered at the South Pole. And they put their beers in a heating area because they don't want them to freeze.
Yeah.
So they got to heat the beers to keep them nice.
I understand, the first explorers did not have beer, but you did.
Beer is very rare in the deep field because every pound of stuff you bring with you is a pound that you have to fly from New Zealand to McMurdo to the deep field. So we typically bring whiskey instead. Beer weighs too much.
Because it doesn't freeze as
And
bad.
it doesn't freeze as easily, and it's lighter per
Oh.
unit. Of.
I bet you that's like currency. If you just joined us, you are listening to Planet Watch. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman.
I was Joe Jordan, and we were going to say how you can get a hold of our guest as well as us between shows, but in particular right now, if you want to ask a question or interact with us, email to radioplanetwatch@gmail.com. That's radioplanetwatch, all one word, @gmail.com.
We're also on Facebook. And if you wanted to watch, are we streaming, Tommy? We are actually
On YouTube.
streaming. We're on YouTube. Okay, so if you want to comment on our Facebook page, we will also get your comments. Go to Radio Planet Watch. If you just go onto Facebook, if you're one of those people who has an account, go on there and type in Radio Planet Watch, and you're going to see our page, and you can ask us a question that way as well. And if you can't reach us any of those other ways, you're welcome to call KSCO, and Jason will maybe type the question into us if you would like to have it that way. We don't take calls because we're too busy talking about whiskey in the Antarctic. But I did want to get to why you're going to the extreme parts of the Earth to do this. And I wanted to set the stage a little bit in saying that, the Earth has these two giant poles, and they're covered in ice. And as the oceans warm, there's a lot of concern about how fast these sheets are moving off of the land and onto the water, or actually melting, which are two different things as far as the effect of sea level rise. And so what you're doing there is studying how they shift off of the land and what's under them. That's a very, of course, simplistic way of describing what you're doing. But you gave a talk recently in Santa Cruz to a group of people who are very interested in seeing your slideshow. If people want to see some of your images, there's 4 of them up on our Facebook page currently if you go to Radio Planet Watch. You're also studying seismic waves, in other words, like we would study earthquakes, that are telling you some things. So tell me what you're after to know when you've been doing these studies and what you're using to learn what's happening.
Yeah, sure. So Antarctica is covered in ice, and the ice is constantly sliding from sort of the thick middle of the ice sheet out towards the ocean, where it can break off or melt. And as it slides from the middle out to the edges, depending on what it's sliding over, it goes at different speeds and it makes different noises. And so I use seismometers, which we usually use to record earthquakes, which is just rocks sliding past rocks. I use seismometers to record ice quakes, which is what happens when the ice slides over something underneath it.
Do you actually feel ice quakes when there's a real big movement? If you're sitting on the ice in Antarctica, do you feel them?
I've never felt any ice quakes. Their magnitudes are somewhere in the range of -1 to 0, so they're really small.
But they're enough to be picked up by machinery.
Yeah.
So part of your job when you're there is what? What are you doing the whole time? You're obviously not sitting around drinking whiskey in your tent,
No.
except in the off hours.
Only on Christmas.
Only on Christmas.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are you doing?
Most of what we're doing is installing instrumentation and digging it up and bringing it back to the surface in subsequent years so that we can get the data off of it. And so that involves either getting on a plane or getting onto a snow machine with a bunch of sleds and flying or driving out to the site we want to put an instrument in and unloading it and setting it up.
And these are how big of instruments? And how do you even find, it's like a needle in the haystack of a white expanse. How do you find them again? You bury it in the snow,
That's a very
come back
good
a year
question.
later and like, oh, it's gone. The
Very
snow-
good question. We use GPS. Everybody in the field has their own handheld GPS because it's basically how you would get back to camp if you got lost. So we go out to a predetermined location. We basically just follow the GPS in the direction it points us. And when we get to the site, the GPS will say, you are 0 feet away from whatever your latitude and longitude is. And then you have basically a waypoint that you can use to navigate back to that site the next year.
But let me ask you now. I was thinking maybe you can home in on a signal being emitted from the device. That would be very straightforward if that were possible. But instead, it sounds like you record an exact position where you buried it, then you go back to that position. But if the ice moved a bunch, maybe it doesn't move enough in between the times to carry the thing off.
Yeah, so the sites definitely move between subsequent years, but no more than maybe a quarter mile at the most. So because it's flat white and everything has a solar panel to power it, you can pretty easily pick out the black solar panels against the flat white. Yeah. So even though they move, you can find them.
Oh, yeah.
And you have to dig them up. And so,
Yeah.
and one would wonder in this day of satellite communications why they don't talk to a satellite, so you don't have to go physically out and get them. Why is that?
It's a good question. It is very, very cold there and requires a lot of power to communicate with satellites. And so we have to both keep the instruments warm and we have to keep them running, and adding the additional draw of having to actually communicate with satellites constantly basically requires too much power. There's a cost-benefit analysis between bringing 25 extra car batteries and just going back the next year.
Sure, human power. So what did you learn after you get all your data, you get back supposedly in one piece without freezing anything off, and you get back to the lab, and what are you hoping to learn?
Well, I'm hoping to learn about the properties of the materials underneath the fast-moving ice, using this seismic data, observing these ice quakes, which helps us understand which parts of the bottom of the ice are more resistant to flow, which parts allow it to flow really fast, which parts prevent it from flowing really fast, and how both of those areas might affect how the ice flows in a changing climate.
Okay, so we're in a more rapidly changing climate than perhaps we were 1,000 years ago, and so the why know this is that, and I believe you said this in your talk, and correct me if I'm wrong, the speed with which these guys are moving out to sea impacts how fast the ocean might rise. Is that there is a connection between those two things?
Yes, there is. Yeah.
Okay, good. Because there's a new article, I think it was just out a couple days ago in Science News, how deep water surfaces around Antarctica and upwelling of warm water are affecting all of this ice, because apparently it's melting from underneath, which is kind of what you were saying in your talk, that the underneath melting causes it to slide quicker because it's like a sled with a pointy front or something. I don't know.
The incursion of warmer than usual ocean water melts the place. It basically melts the place where the ice starts to float. And if you melt the place where the ice starts to float back farther and farther, the ocean doesn't really offer any resistance to the flow of this ice. So as that grounding line where the ice begins to float gets melted back farther and farther, the ice can speed up.
Yeah, it's kind of like the water will lift the ice off the rocks, whereas right now, or heretofore, you've had jagged kind of sticking points on the rocks below that have helped halt or slow the ice movement outward. But now, as you begin to press upward on the bottom of the ice from the ocean buoyancy effect, that makes it harder to stop it.
Even more than buoyancy, it's literally just melting the bottom of the ice.
Mm-hmm. So what would happen to sea level if all of those sheets melted underneath and floated out to sea?
Floated out.
Yeah.
The West Antarctic ice sheet, I think it has about 20 feet worth of sea level rise in it, approximately. I think it's 6 meters, so about 20 feet.
Just floating out would cause that, not in terms of displacement or if it melted all?
Once the ice is floating in the ocean, it has the same effect as if it's melted. So.
Yeah, it's like pouring ice cubes into a glass of water. That raises the water level because the ice is sitting on the land now. Although the West Antarctic ice sheet, the land is below sea level that it's sitting on, but it's still grounded, right? Whereas the East Antarctic, which is a much bigger ice sheet, and apparently, well, in your talk anyway, it didn't look like there was that much research going on over there, but there must be some. That one is on high land and is not considered as immediate a threat. But what do you know about the East Antarctic and what's going on out there? Anyway?
East Antarctica, yeah. It is a significantly bigger ice sheet. It has a lot more ice in it. And in many parts of the East Antarctic coast, we actually think that the ice is getting thicker. So it has a positive mass balance. It's accumulating more snow every year than is is being ejected out into the ocean in East Antarctica right now. There are a couple of glaciers that are grounded below sea level, that are sitting on land below sea level, that some scientists are worried about and thinking about. And it's mostly other countries who research East Antarctica.
Is there an international sharing of this information? I mean, we all do live in the same planet. We're sharing oceans. We're sharing a planet. Is there a lot of cooperation between these international groups, or do they each have their own studies going on?
There definitely is. Some of the biggest projects are all international.
Good. Is there a centralized source for keeping all that information?
There is it for American data. I'm not sure about internationally, though.
I worry about our part of it these days with all the hiding and scrubbing of public websites and such, and data that was gathered by scientists that are monitoring these things. So I'm hoping other countries will keep that going, even if, sadly, ours may be falling behind by a few years.
You know, there's another thing Grace can tell us about, in addition to what we've been talking about monitoring and measuring the scraping of the bottom of the ice against the solid ground below, and you can get some info on like whether the boundary between the ice and the ground is crunchy or smooth, for instance, just based on all these little micro quakes that you're measuring. But in addition to that, a whole different kind of measurement, which you're probably not directly involved with, but you know people who are, is what you were calling crustal rebound.
Yeah.
And it's more of a matter of monitoring the exact position vertically of sensors that are planted in the ice. Tell us more about
crustal rebound. That sounds like what happens to my pizza. Does it happen to the Earth as well?
Or
if
a souffle.
you push your finger in it and it rebounds, it's done.
Yeah, it's exactly like that.
Okay.
The Earth is done.
Yeah.
Cooked. Yeah. So if an ice sheet grows on the surface of the Earth, it weighs a lot. It weighs a huge amount, and so that actually can push the surface of the Earth down with all of its weight. And so then, if the ice begins to thin, as is currently happening in some parts of Antarctica, the surface of the Earth, the Earth's crust, can actually bounce back up.
How fast? not a trampoline speed.
Not
right?
trampoline,
No.
yeah. Surprisingly fast considering it's made of rock. It's like something like 2 centimeters a year or more.
Wow. Yeah.
It's an inch, a little less than an inch.
Yeah.
So when that big sheet came off of the peninsula in Antarctica, what was it? A Larsen 2 ice shelf. Piece of it broke off. Did people measure how buoyant the rock was under it?
Well, so that's an ice shelf, which means it's already floating.
Okay.
Yeah,
So it's not contributing.
Not contributing. Okay. So, but someone is tracking that piece of it now that it's floating away. Wasn't it the Shackleton expedition that was in South Pole doing all the floating around, hoping to get rescued?
Well, they had to. I don't know the details. They overwintered there. Well, they were there for one full winter of darkness and nearly 2 years. Fortunately for them, it wasn't 2 winters. Don't think they would have made it, but they pulled off the most miraculous recovery from a tight spot that has ever been done in the history of humanity.
That's an amazing story. I think I'll just post a map, maybe, just for fun, of the Shackleton expedition. Why don't we do that on our Facebook page? Just because it'll give you a sense for Antarctica. They were near the peninsula we're talking about, and they were floating. They got crushed in the ice. Their ship got stuck, and they went out on foot, hopping from iceberg to iceberg as they would fall apart, and they kept their dogs with them for the longest time before they eat them, maybe. Sorry, dog lovers. Got to do what you got to do, though, I'm saying. Anyhow.
That's the one that he wrote a memoir about, right?
It's called Endurance.
It's very interesting.
Yes.
It's amazing. Totally
It's really the best book about that part of the world that you can imagine, because it also talks about the various critters that were there that actually saved them by eating them.
By them eating them.
By the expedition
by the
eating. They almost got almost
Yeah.
the other way around. There was a leopard seal that almost ate one of the guys, and he shot it, and it was coming straight at him out of a flow. It came out of a hole, and they're giant. I can't even tell you how big they are, but they have very big teeth, and they could eat a guy very quickly. And he saved himself. Tommy.
Hey, Grace, I was wondering, what animals did you see on your expedition?
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah.
People.
Lots of people. Well, actually, not that many people. At McMurdo, which is coastal, McMurdo Station is on an island. There are lots and lots of seals that pop up through the sea ice, and if you're lucky, you get to see a penguin.
Oh my God.
And so I've seen Adelie penguins and a couple of emperor penguins, and they're super cute, and they just walk right up to you because I think that they think that you're a penguin also.
Oh wow, that's so cool.
Yeah.
They've never seen a person anyway, right? So it's just a very large,
They just
weird
don't
dress.
know.
I'm not sure.
And they've never looked in a mirror, so they don't know what they look like in a mirror. They think they look like you.
They look very cute. I have to say, I was in Patagonia and they had little jackass penguins that braid like donkeys.
Yeah.
And they live in holes in the ground. And there were 500,000 of them just nesting in one place. And I think they make a round of Antarctica when they feed. So that might have been what you saw.
Mm-hmm.
I was in Tasmania off Australia and saw the fairy penguins, little tiny penguins. Yeah. So now tell us what getting back from Antarctica is like. I guess you come right back to Christchurch. I mean, other people go out of Punta Arenas, Chile, for instance, other research expeditions. But yeah, what new delights for your senses awaited you back on the mainland?
Yeah, so we return the way we came. We fly back through Christchurch, New Zealand, and Antarctic fieldwork is conducted largely in the Antarctic summer, which is our northern hemisphere winter. And so you go to Antarctica and it's like more winter, and then you've been in the great white wilds for so long, and you get back to New Zealand and all of a sudden everything smells just like so much more than you're used to. It smells like grass because it's the summer. It smells like lots of vegetation and things like that.
So there's not much scent at all. When you're in Antarctica, there's nothing to rot, or even in cold weather, your sense of smell is limited. So you must have had, it's like turning up a volume when you came back to New Zealand.
And there's humidity in New Zealand, in Christchurch, and there's essentially no humidity in the ice sheet.
That must be so weird.
Yeah.
Is there something psychologically that happens when you're not looking at anything variant? Like the only variation in height, weight, color is your tent. I mean, what happens to your head? I'm curious about the psychology of exploration. You were only there, for a certain number of weeks compared to these guys and the Endurance, 2 years.
Yeah.
But, what was that like psychologically after maybe the first, second, third week?
Sure. I mean, I think everyone has kind of their own experience of it. For me, it became really, the people I was with became very important. And my relationships with the group and the new friends and acquaintances I made, just the importance of them is magnified by the fact that you're sort of in the middle of nowhere.
You rely on them so heavily.
Oh, yeah.
And what about any danger that you might have been in? Was there ever a time you felt like maybe the edge between you and survival maybe got thinner?
The edge between me and survival. Not particularly. We do a pretty good job in the U.S. Antarctic program of managing risk, I think. And so it is obviously potentially very dangerous to fly around in an airplane in Antarctica, but we only fly when the weather's good, and we take care of our planes really carefully. For example, there are places on the ice sheet where, because of the way the ice is moving, there are large crevasses that have opened up and that you can't necessarily see as you walk or drive across them. And so those are places we avoid, or we take great care when we go there. So I think in general, it's not a place where you feel like you're just surviving. It's a place where you feel like someone has thought of the risk and assessed whether or not you need to be worried about it.
Mm-hmm. So you never felt at risk, or you never felt worried when you were there. How about when the plane took off and left you guys far from anything?
Yeah, that's a special moment for sure. It's mostly exciting, It's like, oh yes, we finally get to do something. we get to set up our own lives and live out here in the wilderness.
And it's really a place no humans are supposed to be. I mean, that's the other interesting thing about it. There's nobody settled there. There's no native peoples that used to live there.
Right.
Maybe we were talking in the car that it was just too far from them, from the mainland, but just too hostile for all the reasons you just cited.
Yeah, it gets very, very cold in the winter.
Yeah.
It would be very difficult to survive there in the winter.
One thing I remember,
We're going to take a
to
short break
here?
right now, and we'll be right back with Grace Barczyk and her Antarctic exploration stories right here on Planet Watch.
The following is a KSCO editorial. Here is KSCO owner Michael Zwirling.
At a time when people are talking more and more about a looming civil war in our country, I want to share 2 KSCO listener emails that I have received during the past 24 hours. Emailer A says, "Not that you care, but I am done listening to your station. I am not going to rant. Basically, I'm tired of all the politically correct crap you promote on your station, and I'm sick of hearing that big mouth nobody Billy Sunshine run his mouth every day. I just wish I could magically create a giant toilet bowl and flush your station along with Alex Darnell and the rest of your politically correct group. The only normal one there is Charlie, and he's got to be the glue holding your piece of bleep radio station together. Keep on going with your agenda to ruin this country." Emailer B says, "Regarding Georgia, I am disgusted and ashamed to be identified as coming from the same county as that in which this white extremist broadcaster is given a media platform from which to rant dementedly about white genocide in America. If there were ever an incentive to foster such a genocide, it would be her and her like. In fact, of course, any genocide is inhumane and outrageous to advocate. What is needed is to shut the woman up, now." Though speaking from opposite perspectives, both emailer A and emailer B have one striking thing in common. They both want to shut down free speech. I believe that if they and other enemies of free speech are successful, then there will indeed be a civil war in our country, sooner than we think. Opposition to free speech and free thought has gotten so strong and overpowering now that locally, an outspoken but politically incorrect talk host on KSCO has resigned, and one of the most popular restaurants for nearly 4 decades has been forced to close. Do we want a civil war? If yes, stay the course. It is working beautifully. If no, fight the urge to kill free speech by using free speech in reasonable civil discussion, and appreciate that you still have it. KSCO KOMY remains proud to be the venue for free speech and reasonable discussion. For KSCO and KOMY, I'm Michael Zwirling.
Welcome back to Planet Watch. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman.
And Joe Jordan here.
Thank you for listening. We are big solutions to planet-sized problems, and we're talking about the ice sheets of Antarctica with an Antarctic explorer who is here on the mainland back safe and doing some great science among many women who are featured in the Science on Tap series in Santa Cruz, which highlights women scientists, of which we need more. So if you're a woman thinking about going into the sciences and you're inspired by these exciting journeys that you are hearing about, that could be you. And it might not be as glamorous as it sounds when you actually have to, hunker down into your tent when there's a storm for 24 hours. But maybe then again, it is. So we're glad to have Grace Barczyk. She is here with us in studio. Thanks, Grace, for being a guest here on Planet Watch.
Glad to be here.
And yay for women in science and engineering. And there was one, we were going to talk a little more about the actual science with Grace here, but quick frivolous question. From her talk the other night, she mentioned how some of the most important people in Antarctic expeditions are the cooks, and they have really good cooks there. And so I'm guessing we have a lot of talented chefs around Santa Cruz here, and I guess you can actually be paid to go to Antarctica and cook for people down there, right?
That's right. The standards are very high.
Okay, that's a challenge. Maybe I'll go learn how to cook here soon. Yeah. So, but now, Grace, you were mentioning during that break about some other kinds of science that we haven't gotten to yet, and we got about, a few minutes left. Why don't you tell us briefly what those are and whether you're involved at all with them and what you know about them.
Yeah, sure. So I think we talked a little bit about using seismometers and using GPS to characterize the ice sheet. Another very important tool that we use a lot in Antarctica is actually ground penetrating radar, ice penetrating radar, which can basically see through the ice sheet and we can image how thick it is and a little bit about what the materials underneath are. So that's an important complement to the seismometers, I think.
And those radars are shot from satellites, right?
The radars are either dragged along the surface by a snow machine or on an airplane. So the U.S. has had these really large air expeditions to run radar.
And then you did mention something about satellites, though, also.
Yes, and then the most, by far, complete and continuous data sets we get about Antarctica are satellite-based. So we can look at whether the ice sheet is getting thicker or thinner and what its velocity is, and then some other things by looking at satellite data.
And is some of this applicable to earthquake science? Are you guys sharing methodology? And you said in your talk there were sensors all over California. Of course, here we're quite interested in knowing more about earthquakes.
Yes. Mostly how it works is that I take things that I've learned about how we study earthquakes and I apply them to the ice sheet.
So it goes the other way.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah.
And ice behaves differently than rock, obviously, when it's making quakes.
Yes,
'cause
it's a lot softer.
Yeah, there's less tension, right, that
Yeah.
builds up. It would break before a rock would break.
Yeah.
So as we know, some of these earthquakes are caused by the rocks tensioning each other, then one of them breaking off deep in the earth, the whole fault.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what causes us to shimmy around here in California. Well, any last things you wanted to talk about? And Tommy had a question before we close.
I was just
go on.
hoping you could tell us what one of your favorite experiences was on your expeditions.
Yeah, I have lots of favorite experiences. I'll say two things. One, it's just incredibly beautiful there. It's like the bluest sky you've ever seen, and the sort of crisp, clear air is just amazingly beautiful. And I love the snow, so it's great to be there. And then another, I had a friend who, so we usually dig out space at the front of our tents to put our boots in, to sort of like sit down and take our boots off when we're getting into bed at night. And he started digging that hole, and then he just kept digging, and he dug, I think, probably like 10 feet under the surface, and he built a snow cave.
Oh my God.
He dug out a snow cave complete with seats along the sides and a little mini bar space and a disco ball.
Awesome.
So that was pretty fun.
How do you light up the disco ball?
Probably batteries. I don't
Flashlight?
remember. Yeah, flashlight.
Solar powered.
Yeah.
Actually, I was noticing that the solar panels that you see down there that are associated with all these stations, they're all mounted vertically. And there's a reason for that. The sun does never get above 23.5 degrees angle above the horizon. So the sun's coming in from pretty much out on the horizon all year long, or half the year long when it's above the horizon. So, your solar panels are all standing vertically.
And the sun just goes basically in circles around you. It never goes down.
Oh, weird.
And
That
so
must
does the
be
moon.
strange. And so telling what time it is by looking where the sun is in the sky is not working unless you have a compass.
Unless
know?
you know
Right.
which direction is north. Yeah.
And sleep must be strange too, because you don't do it by the sun. You just
Yeah, you have to convince yourself to go to sleep.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and you have to cover your eyes. Otherwise, you'd just be awake all the time.
You create a fake diurnal cycle
Yeah.
for yourself, right? Because we've learned a lot about brainwaves and sun creating sleep need. And so you would have to create your artificial sleep need. This is all so fascinating. If people want to learn more about your work, is there some website or published paper or anything they could go read?
I have a website. It is currently not live yet, but will be soon. And you could maybe look at the UC Santa Cruz glaciology blog. There's a little bit of stuff on there. And I have a paper that hopefully will be coming out soon, but is not published yet.
You'll have to send that to us.
Yeah, I will.
When it comes out, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're going to segue on to some sky and more sky stuff, because we're just talking about the solar processes around the Antarctic area. But thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to hearing how your career turns out as you go on to other things.
Thank you for having me.
Grace
Yeah,
Barczyk.
thanks for coming on short notice.
Indeed. And Joe, what do we got in the sky and other things this next couple of weeks? Anything we ought to know to be watching for?
Well, let's see. A couple more nights from today, which is what? September already, September 3rd. We've got the full moon. And if you watch the moon the next few evenings, you'll see it keeps moving each night at the same time. It's farther east of where it was the night before. And that's because as it moves around the sky, it takes about a month to go all the way around the world. And so it jerks a little bit from one night to the next. And so pretty soon it will be a crescent moon in the morning, and it'll be next to the blazing planet Venus in the early morning sky. But let's see. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the eclipse. You know, it's that eclipse was just so amazing. All of them are when they're total eclipse. You have to go see a total eclipse. Now, if you missed this last one, look, you're going to have another chance to see one in the continental United States in 7 years, in 2024, I think it is. I didn't memorize the date, but we've got some time here. And that one goes from Texas up through to Maine. And look, you have to, if you didn't do it this last time, you really have to go into the path of totality. There is just, I've talked to so many people who said, well, I saw a 92% one. That was good enough. No, it wasn't. It's just a completely different universe, as Rachel and Tommy and I can all attest. Now, I don't know if you managed to get there. But, oh, you did? Where'd you see it?
I saw it in St. Louis.
Oh, yeah, I've got friends there in Missouri.
Yeah.
That was where it was quite a few seconds longer than here. I think it was about the longest in Missouri. Good thing you had clear skies that time of day back there, and this time of year could be thunderstorm risk. But anyway, the best eclipse, I got to tell you, the best eclipse in the future, especially for you youngsters out there, it's going to be all the way across the United States from Northern California through Nevada and Utah, which would be an epic place to see a total eclipse, all the way down, again, out to the East Coast. And it's a really fat trail, unlike this last one, and it lasts like 7 minutes. But it's in the year 2045, and I'm going to be 103 then. So, hey, that's a good incentive to cut back on the sugar and, get more exercise. So, but look, for you youngsters out there, 2045, that is going to be the ultimate eclipse. And so, total eclipse of the sun.
Certainly will. I wanted to make sure to give out our email again. And we always would welcome your questions. And even if you didn't get them in time to ask our guest, we're always happy to forward them to our guests if they're willing. And then they can reply back to your questions. So remember, that's radioplanetwatch@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook, Planet Watch Radio, just to confuse you further. Just look us up there, and you can not only comment, you can look at our show video-wise once it's finished on YouTube. If you missed part of it, you can go watch it again and see some of the slides that we put up, as well as a few suggestions for movies about the Antarctic, including Werner Herzog's movie, which is a wonderful film. If you haven't seen it, it's called Encounters at the End of the World. And it features Henry Kaiser doing music and Werner Herzog doing the interviews of the people living around McMurdo and environs, and also the best underwater images of these giant clams swimming around under the ice. You don't know what's under there till you get someone who's brave enough to get a big, thick wetsuit and a camera, and it's crystal clear. There's almost nothing under there except these weird giant clams, like the size of a VW bus, I think, that clap around to swim. It was just strange. So, go check that out. That's Encounters at the End of the World. I posted a link to the preview.
That's not a new movie, is it?
No,
It's been around for a while.
2007.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
It might have changed there, but I bet not too much.
Hey, well, I've got a palindrome for you. This is sort of a political palindrome, actually. You know what a palindrome is, right? It's a word or a phrase or a sentence that's spelled exactly the same forwards as backwards. This one requires a little bit of history. We've had some really clueless people just lately, a whole spate of them in the government. But it has been that way in past times, notably in the administration of Ronald Reagan, I believe it was, who was kind of a watershed eruption in American politics that kind of started this whole nonsense. He had an advisor named John Sununu. Anybody remember him? SUNUNU. And he got into trouble also, like a lot of these people who are getting into trouble nowadays from what they're saying and doing. And anyway, here's a good palindrome for you that came out about that time. It was, wonder if Sununu's fired now.
That's
So
great.
run that one backwards and you get, wonder if Sununu's fired now.
Can
So
you work on one for our modern time that involves, Tillerson and maybe Pruitt all in there in one giant palindrome?
I don't invent these things.
Somebody does.
Although, actually, you know what? I did come up with, I remembered it. On the way up to the eclipse, we drove past Wairika, the town of Wairika in far northern California, and there's a bakery there. So now how do we get a palindrome out of that? Wairika Bakery.
Great.
So,
Bet they didn't even know when they invented that they were
and
becoming...
another cute little one having to do with food. I mean, this is really simple. It doesn't take much time. If you're taking a diary of what you ate, like for snacks or for lunch, and you ate some feta cheese, you could just write a note to yourself, 8 feta. 8 feta. That's a palindrome. As is a Toyota. A Toyota. That's a palindrome. So I've got some really long ones, but I did them on a past show.
Sit on a potato pan, Otis. I remember that one.
Oh, yes.
That's a good one. Not that anybody would. And if you're Otis, you're probably really tired of hearing that palindrome.
Well, this all is apropos of Leonardo, we ought to do a show on him. One of my heroes, one of the greatest scientists and artists in the whole world. And he
Not
was
DiCaprio.
Leonardo da Vinci. And
He's an artist of sorts.
DiCaprio's not bad, but Da Vinci,
Bad looking.
he could do things forwards and backwards and was gifted in both hemispheres. And, anyway, there was something I was going to say about that, but
Stay tuned.
can't remember.
Is that a palindrome? Stay tuned.
No, not quite. Not quite. But
We thank you for tuning in. This has been Planet Watch. We want to thank our engineer, Jason Struby, and we want to thank KSCO Radio for giving us a platform. Thank you to our partner affiliates in Ohio. Thanks for running our show.
And keep an eye on the sky.
This is Planet Watch. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman with Joe Jordan. Stay tuned.
KSCO, Santa Cruz.
CBS News, I'm Pam Coulter. A U.S. intelligence official says there is high confidence that North Korea has tested an advanced nuclear device, not inconsistent with Pyongyang's claims that it was a hydrogen bomb. After meeting with President Trump at the White House today, Defense Secretary James Mattis warned
any threat to the United States or its territories, including Guam or our allies, will be met with a massive military response, a response both effective and overwhelming.
But he added, we are not looking to the total annihilation of North Korea. CBS's Paula Reed has President Trump's response.
The president took to Twitter, denouncing North Korea's actions as hostile